In this video, I'm going to talk about the components of a 5-paragraph essay, and you can see I have the research paper outline pulled up here on the left, and over here I have what would be my pretend essay where I'm writing. So first, starting with the introduction, I need to have a hook, and you have choices here. So you have fact, universal idea, quote, description, or dialogue. A fact would be a statistic. So if you have any statistics, especially if you're doing the civil rights movement or women's rights movement, perhaps you have a startling statistic that has numbers. Like according to whatever, wherever you got your source, or during the women's movement, nearly 1/3 of all women were unemployed. I don't know if that's true, but let's say that you found that fact, and then you would put whoever it came from, Barney Fife or whoever. So we'll put Barney. Barney's his last name, so Edward Barney. Okay. Then you have to have a tie-in or transition to what your topic is going to be about. So you give a little background information. The women's movement in America took place during one of the most tumultuous times in history. Not only were civil rights being protested, but women took to the front lines, so to speak, to fight for equal pay and equal rights. Whatever. That's just some background information. So you can see here I have a hook, because I have a fact, a statistic. You could also have a universal idea. A famous saying is, or in the Constitution, it says all men are created equal, but what it should say is that all people are created equal, right? So you could touch on something like that, a universal statement. You could also use a quote, and in that sense, you would pull a quote from one of your sources, or a quote from the famous person, and maybe some obscure quote that maybe people don't know. So if you've got the Jim Crow laws, you might do something like one of the Jim Crow laws that people aren't that familiar with. So try to find something intriguing to pull people in. Description, you could describe something. Maybe you want to describe an event with the women's rights movement that you read about. So a particular event, like one of the marches or the protests, or describe a sign and women, what the environment was like during one of those events. So that's another option. Dialogue would be more like characters talking back and forth. So that one doesn't really lend itself to this research paper. Okay, so I've got my hook. I've got my background information or tie-in. Now I need to provide my thesis statement. So what am I going to talk about with the civil rights movement? And that's where you have to go back and pull from the project. Should have had this pulled up ahead of time. So, and you probably have these on your support. So if I go down to the women's rights, explain the movement by providing overall goals and a brief timeline of events, as well as what parts of the country were most involved or impacted. So how could you put that into one thing? That would be more like background information on it. What were some key events associated, and who were some key people? Not only were civil rights being protested, but women took to the front lines, so to speak, to fight for equal pay and equal rights. The women's we're going to capitalize it because we're going to call it a movement. Involved some lofty goals over several decades. As well as strong leadership from within the movement, and I guess I have to put events first, as well as some key events to keep the movement moving, to keep the momentum. See, I'm just writing this from the top of my head. I'd go back and edit it later to make it better, but as well as some key events to keep the momentum strong and several, I'll say strong again, to keep the momentum moving in the right direction. And several strong leaders several strong women to lead the way. Okay, so that tells me that my main point number 1 is going to be talking about the goals and the timeline. Right, there's key point 1. Key point 2 is going to be key events. And number 3 is going to be the women. I think it asks you to choose at least 2 women. So there I have my hook, which is a fact. I have my background information or tie-in. And I have my thesis statement, which includes my 3 main points. So that's the basic for your introduction. Now when we get into the next part, if you go back to the outline, it says a topic sentence. So this topic sentence needs to reflect the goals and the timeline. You don't have to say it exactly the same way. When the women's movement began, whatever year that was, you guys that have done the research can pinpoint that. Several goals were established. All right, so you're setting up the timeline and the goals at the same time. So you put the year or whatever it began, several goals were established. Okay, so that's your topic sentence. Then you need to give details. One of these goals was the need for women to receive equal pay for equal work. Then you might have evidence from your sources. So according, maybe use the same person up there, according to whatever his name was, John Barney, then you'd have his quote. Women were underpaid at a rate of 2 to 1 or whatever. Whatever the statistics say. Okay, and then you don't need, you do not need the parenthetical because I already gave Barney up here. And if you give the name here, you don't need it down here. You'd only give a page number if there was a page number, but if you got it from World Online, there wouldn't be a page number. But a lot of you got it out of books, so whatever that page number was in the books is what you'd put there. Then you need to lead out of this quote. This proves that equal pay was a problem needing to be addressed. Okay, and then you lead into your next goal and the timeline. Okay, by 10 years later, women had to address another problem. Thus, they came up with a goal to blah, blah. Okay, so you can see that that's how I would do each main point. I'm approaching the end here. So at the end of that, you'd have a concluding statement, something along the lines of women had several goals which took nearly 50 years to accomplish. Okay, that finishes main point number 1, moving to main point number 2, which is going to be key events.